Dignity doesn't dissolve in dishwater, but there are nights when it comes terrifyingly close. Theo Arsenault had built his fortune the old-fashioned way, by dismantling other people's livelihoods with surgical efficiency and calling it innovation. At 58, the founder and chairman of Arsenault Capital Group commanded a net worth that the financial press loved to argue about, settling somewhere north of $600 million depending on the quarter. He owned a restored Softstone Manor in Westmount, a winter property in the Laurentians, and a reputation in Montreal's financial corridors that people described privately as catastrophic to cross. He had been divorced twice, both times on his own terms, and he had not apologized for anything in 11 years. Not publicly, anyway. Tonight he sat at the head of a private dining room at Chateau Bernard, the most aggressively exclusive restaurant in the city, a place where the Sautinglins for a reservation was 18 months long. The menu changed every evening based on what the chef felt like. The private room Theo had booked, Table Privé Impérial, the staff called it, never out loud in front of guests, was lined in dark walnut and lit by a single pendant of hand-blown amberglass. It smelled of cedar and roasted marrow and money. Across the table sat Callum Dench, the famously paranoid lead negotiator that Theo had been courting for 2 years. Dench was the kind of man who wore a watch that cost more than a car, but never looked at it directly, as though acknowledging time was beneath him. The deal on the table was worth $430 million. It would be the largest single acquisition in Arsenault Capital's history. Theo needed this dinner to be perfect. He had no idea that perfection was already standing just outside the door, carrying a water pitcher and a set of bone china bread plates running on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee. Madeleine was 29 years old, which meant she had been fighting the particular kind of exhaustion that poverty manufactures for nearly 3 of them. She wore the crisp black uniform of Chateau Bernard, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to disappear inside a costume. Her hair was pinned back tightly, not because she liked it that way, but because the front-of-house manager, a meticulous man named Bertrand Foy, conducted what he called a presentation inspection every evening before service, and a single strand loose at the temple was grounds for a verbal correction delivered just loudly enough for the other servers to hear. Madeleine had learned to be invisible in rooms like this. She was good at it. What the guests in those rooms never thought to wonder was what happened to her between shifts. They didn't think about the bus she took home at 2 in the morning because she couldn't afford the parking, or the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter of her apartment in Rosemont that she sorted by threat level each Sunday. They didn't know that 3 years ago she had been 2 semesters away from completing her master's in pharmacology at the Université de Montreal, ranking 2nd in her cohort with a research fellowship already offered and accepted. They didn't know about her father either. René Ouellet had been a carpenter for 30 years, the kind of man whose hands told the whole story of his life. When the diagnosis came, a degenerative neurological condition affecting his motor control, progressive, and currently untreatable, the research fellowship had quietly become a fantasy. The experimental therapy, available through a private neurology clinic in Ottawa, cost $42,000 per treatment cycle. The family needed money immediately, real money, not the kind that arrived in 4-year installments from an academic grant. Madeleine had deferred her degree with the sincere intention of returning. That had been 28 months ago. She still had her pharmacology textbooks stacked beside her bed. She still read them on the bus. Tonight, she was assigned to the private corridor, which meant covering table privé impérial and 2 smaller dining alcoves. She had managed the room once before and had not made a mistake, which in Bertrand Foy's framework was not a compliment but simply a base expectation. She pushed through the service door with the bread plates balanced on her left forearm, her right hand controlling the water pitcher, and took in the room in the practiced single sweep she had trained herself to do. 2 guests, senior male, late 50s, expensive suit, rigid posture, the particular set to the jaw of a man performing confidence. He was already talking before she reached the table, which meant he was nervous about something. The second man was quieter, watchful, with the stillness of someone whose job was to find flaws. She set the bread plates without sound and poured the water with her eyes tilted respectfully downward. Then she noticed Theo Arsenault's hand. She had good eyes for this. Living with her father's condition had trained her to watch for the specific, small betrayals that bodies make before they announce themselves dramatically. The micro-tremor in Theo's left index finger as it rested against the linen tablecloth was exactly the kind of involuntary flutter that most people would interpret as nothing: a cold room, a long day, too much coffee. But Madeleine had spent 3 years watching those exact flickers in her father's hands, and she had spent 2 years studying pharmacokinetics. She also noticed, because she was thorough and because it was her job to know the room, the leather medical bag sitting on the chair to Theo's left. The kind doctors who did private house calls carried, the kind that snapped shut with a brass clasp and cost $300. It had been tucked partly under the chair's sloping back, visible only if you were paying attention. Madeleine was always paying attention. She withdrew from the room quietly and went to check the reservation notes in the front-of-house system. Theo Arsenault. She'd heard the name. Everyone in Montreal had heard the name. She pulled up the client notes that Bertrand's assistant had compiled for VIP bookings. Allergies, preferences, historical complaints. There was a note flagged in red. Client has documented chronic hiccup disorder, severe, with known episodes of laryngospasm. Carries emergency medication. Staff are instructed not to engage with or draw attention to any episode. Alert management only. She stood at the front-of-house terminal for 3 additional seconds, reading that notation with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what it meant. Laryngospasm. She knew what that was from 2 different directions. She knew it from her pharmacology coursework, from the chapter on upper airway complications, and the drug interactions most likely to precipitate them. And she knew it from her father, who had experienced 2 episodes in the past year as his condition progressed, episodes that had ended with paramedics in the apartment hallway, and Madeleine kneeling on the kitchen floor, her hands behind his ears, counting to 3. She went back to her station and kept her eyes on the room. The dinner progressed normally for 40 minutes. The bread was cleared, the amuse-bouche arrived from the kitchen, and Theo Arsenault's negotiation appeared to be reaching a delicate altitude. His voice had the careful, constructed evenness of a man keeping a very specific kind of pressure applied. Callum Dench ate slowly and said little, which Madeleine had already identified as a power move. He was waiting for Arsenault to overextend. Then the hiccup happened. It wasn't the subtle, socially inconvenient kind. It was the kind that came from somewhere wrong, a sharp, barking contraction that made Dench flinch backward slightly in his chair. Theo went very still afterward, which Madeleine recognized as the stillness that preceded something worse. He pressed his fingers to his throat, his jaw tightened. She was already moving toward the service door when the second spasm hit. The sound Theo made was not a hiccup anymore. It was the specific, horrifying, stridorous wheeze of an airway that was losing the argument with itself. He pushed back from the table abruptly, the chair legs scraping hard against the floor, and one hand flew to his collar and yanked the tie loose with a violence that scattered a bread roll onto the carpet. Dench stood up. The private physician, Dr. Armand Fleury, Madeleine would learn the name later, erupted from his chair at the end of the table. He was a patrician man in his late 60s, with silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his professional life, which meant he had never been seriously tested. He grabbed his medical bag with practiced authority and snapped it open on the table. "I've got him," he said crisply, pulling out a syringe and an ampule. "Mr. Arsenault, I need you to be still." Theo could not be still. He was on his feet now, both hands at his throat, his face cycling through shades that had no business appearing on a living person. The sound coming from his airway was thin and high-pitched and getting worse, which meant air was still moving, but the window was closing fast. Madeleine came through the service door. She took in the scene in 1 second. Fleury was preparing to inject. The syringe contained what she was almost certain was a high-dose benzodiazepine. She could read the label from 6 feet. She had been reading labels like that for 2 years, and Theo Arsenault's oxygen saturation was visibly plummeting. Administering a central nervous system depressant to a man in active laryngospasm with compromised oxygenation was not a rescue. It was a mechanism of death presented as a rescue. She crossed the room. "Don't give him that injection," she said. Fleury's head turned. His expression completed a rapid and withering assessment of her. The black uniform, the server's apron, the water pitcher still in her hand, and dismissed her in under a second. "Excuse me," he said, with the specific courtesy that meant its exact opposite. "The sedative will suppress his respiratory drive," Madeleine said, and she had put her server voice away entirely, reaching instead for the voice she had used in pharmacology's seminars, the one that expected to be taken seriously. "He's already hypoxic. You'll collapse the airway completely. Young lady, he needs a laryngospasm notch maneuver, bilateral pressure. It will break the vagal override without chemical suppression." She was already setting down the water pitcher. "I need you to hold his shoulders." Fleury stepped physically between her and Theo, which she had anticipated. Dench was pressed against the far wall, the room security, a thick-necked man in a dark suit who had been standing near the door, took a step forward. "Get her out," Fleury said to the security guard. Madeleine looked directly at the security guard. "If he injects that sedative and Mr. Arsenault stops breathing," she said, her voice completely level, "you will have watched it happen, and I will say so to whoever asks." The security guard stopped. She stepped around Fleury, who was so shocked by the movement that he didn't immediately react, and positioned herself behind Theo, who had sunk to his knees on the floor and was no longer fighting. The transition from thrashing to stillness in laryngospasm was not a good sign. It meant the body was running out of the energy required to panic. "Mr. Arsenault," she said quietly, her hands moving to either side of his face, her fingers finding the anatomical landmarks she needed, the groove behind each earlobe, the notch between the mastoid and the posteriors on her father. She had practiced this on her father. She had practiced it until it became something closer to reflex than decision. "I'm going to press here. It's going to hurt. Let it." She applied bilateral upward pressure with both thumbs, simultaneously thrusting his jaw forward and holding it there with controlled, deliberate force. The room was silent enough that she could hear the amber light fixture hum. 4 seconds. Then Theo Arsenault's body convulsed once, violently, from his shoulders to his diaphragm, and he pulled in a breath that sounded like something tearing. It was not a graceful sound. It was not the kind of sound that belonged in a $400 a plate dining room. It was the most necessary sound, that Madeleine had ever heard in her life, and she felt something release in her own chest as it happened. He breathed again, and again. The terrible color began to leave his face. She released the pressure and sat back on her heels. For a long moment, the only sounds in the room were Theo Arsenault breathing and the distant percussion of the kitchen, muffled by walnut paneling. Callum Dench had not moved from the far wall. Dr. Fleury was standing with the syringe still in his hand, looking at the floor. Theo's turned his head slowly and looked at Madeleine. His voice, when it came, was wrecked and barely audible. "Who are you?" She looked back at him steadily. "Your server for this evening," she said. "Can I get you anything?" He stared at her for another long moment. Then, despite everything, something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, and Theo refused it, which apparently was consistent with his character. He was assessed, stabilized, and given a clean bill of immediate survival by the paramedics, who had little choice but to document that the intervention had already been performed successfully by a person who was, according to the incident report, a food service professional. Madeleine finished her shift. Bertrand Foy found her at the end of service check-in with an expression that suggested she had failed several inspections simultaneously. He was holding a printed document in a manila folder. He placed it on the service station counter between them without looking at her directly. "Mr. Arsenault's office contacted the restaurant this evening," Foy said, examining a point somewhere above her left shoulder. "You made physical contact with a VIP guest. You interfered with a licensed physician's medical care. You created a significant disruption during a confidential business dinner." He paused. "Your employment here is terminated, effective the end of this shift." Madeleine looked at the folder. "There is a severance document inside," Foy continued. "Mr. Arsenault's legal team has provided a gratuity in recognition of the evening." His pronunciation of the word gratuity carried several layers of institutional deniability. $15,000, provided you sign the attached non-disclosure agreement covering any events, conversations, or observations from this evening. His team has also been in touch with our ownership. Everyone is agreed that this is a generous resolution. She opened the folder. $15,000. She stared at the number for a moment, running calculations that were almost involuntary by now. Rent, 3 months. 1 partial treatment cycle for René, which would buy him perhaps 40 days of reduced progression. The stack of final notices on her kitchen counter thinned but not eliminated. A couple months of breathing room with nothing solved. Her father's next treatment cycle cost $42,000. The one after that the same. He needed at minimum 4 cycles to complete the protocol. She thought about the laryngospasm notch maneuver. She thought about how long it had taken her to learn it, and from whom, and at what cost. She thought about the night she had knelt on the kitchen linoleum with her father's face in her hands, counting 4 seconds in her head, refusing to let herself be afraid until she was sure it had worked. She closed the folder. "I won't be signing this," she said. Foy blinked. "I'd encourage you to reconsider. You have no legal basis for." He made a promise. She picked up her server's notebook from the counter. She always kept a servos-organized thing in her habit. Some nights it was folded the folder under her arm. He said he'd pay whoever healed him. He said it in front of witnesses. She set the notebook down. "I'm going to hold him to it." Foy laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "He's one of the most powerful men in this province." "I know," Madeleine said. She untied her apron with the same measured efficiency she used for everything, folded it in thirds the way the manual required, and set it on the counter. "Good night, Bertrand." She took the bus home through the late Montreal winter. the city white and orange outside the fogged windows, and she sat with the unopened folder on her lap and looked at nothing in particular. The story broke on a Wednesday. She hadn't planted it. She had made no calls, told no one outside her immediate circle, which consisted of her father and her friend Pascal, who worked in hospital administration and had a principled distaste for non-disclosure agreements. Pascal had, apparently, mentioned the incident to someone she trusted. That person had mentioned it to someone they trusted. By Thursday morning, a financial blog that specialized in monitoring Quebec corporate governance had published a short, briskly worded piece under the headline, Arsenault Capital Chairman's Hidden Medical Condition. Sources suggest merger partners were kept in the dark. By noon, Arsenault Capital's publicly traded subsidiary had shed 9%. By 2 o'clock, Theo Arsenault's communications director had released a statement describing the report as irresponsible and factually deficient. By 3 o'clock, a second piece had appeared, this one with a photograph taken on someone's phone through the amber glass of Table Privé Impérial's door, showing Theo in a black server's uniform, kneeling over him, kneeling over him, with her hands on his face. By 4 o'clock, Callum Dench's office in Vancouver issued a single-line statement. The fund is re-evaluating the terms of the proposed partnership. Theo Arsenault was on the phone with 7 people simultaneously and managing to be difficult with all of them. His lead counsel, a compact and methodical woman named Patricia Howe, arrived at his office at 4:30 with a second folder, different from the one Foy had delivered to Madeleine, but spiritually related to it. She laid it open on his desk. She was good enough at her job that she didn't preamble. Madeleine Ouellet, 29, she said. Dropped out of a pharmacology master's program at UDM 3 years ago. Strong academic record. She was second in her cohort. Father has a progressive neurological condition, significant medical debt. She refused the NDA. She's currently not employed and has no legal representation. Theo looked at the file photograph his team had sourced. It was a headshot from the university's research fellowship announcement, 3 years old. The woman in it looked confident and unhurried, which was an expression he was familiar with from this morning, from a restaurant floor where she had told him to let it hurt and had been right. What is our exposure? He said. Moderate, Patricia said without hesitation. The promise was made under duress, but it was made publicly, and it was witnessed. Dench's assistant filmed the incident. There are also 3 other individuals in that room who heard it. I can argue hypoxic delirium. No court would enforce it unilaterally, but the reputational context matters. Right now, the market story is that you concealed a medical condition from merger partners. She paused. The counter-narrative that wins that argument is the one where you pay the woman who saved your life, and you do it publicly. Theo was quiet for a moment. Pull Hastings' prescribing records for the last 2 years, he said. Patricia nodded. She had already pulled them. Theo looked at the records. Dr. Armand Fleury had taken over his care 26 months ago, at the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance, and had immediately prescribed a combination of a calcium channel blocker for blood pressure management and a benzodiazepine derivative for what Fleury described in his clinical notes as executive performance anxiety. The laryngospasm episodes had begun, according to Theo's calendar, approximately 8 weeks after that prescription was in place. Theo had mentioned this timeline to Fleury once, who had told him it was coincidental and increased the dosage. He thought about the young woman's voice in that room. Calm, certain. The drug interactions most likely to precipitate laryngospasm. He remembered thinking, through the hypoxic grey closing over his vision, that she sounded like someone who had read the relevant chapter very recently. She had been right about the syringe. He didn't need to look up the pharmacology to know that. He'd known it in the room. He'd been in enough boardrooms to recognize when someone understood something better than everyone else present and was being ignored for reasons that had nothing to do with competence. He picked up his phone. "Get me Ouellette," he said. Madeleine was at the pharmacy counter of a Rosemont Jean Coutu, picking up her father's latest prescription refill, when her phone rang with an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. She stepped away from the counter. "Mrs. Ouellette," said a voice she recognized, lower and rougher than it had been Wednesday evening, still carrying the residual damage of a badly abused airway. "This is Theo Arsenault. I'd like to meet." She held the phone for a moment without speaking. Outside, the February slush on Rue Masson was being illuminated in grey-gold slants by the pharmacy's sign. "I'm available tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll send a car." "I have a car," she said. She didn't, but that wasn't the point. There was a brief pause. 10 o'clock, he said, the Westmount office. She arrived at 10 o'clock precisely, which she understood to be a form of statement. The building's lobby attendant had her name and brought her directly to the executive floor without detours. The office Theo occupied was corner-facing, the winter city laid out in all directions under a white sky, and he was already standing when she entered, which she noted. Patricia Howe was present. A young associate sat at a side table with a laptop. Neither of them spoke. Theo Arsenault looked, in natural a man who had stopped sleeping for a few light, like a man who had spent few days and was aggressively refusing to acknowledge it. The bruising behind his earlobes was still faintly visible, a purplish-yellow suggestion along his jawline that his barber had done nothing to conceal. He looked at her with the same directness she remembered from the floor of the dining room. "I had Fleury's prescribing history reviewed last night," he said, "by 2 independent pharmacologists. They confirmed the interaction." His voice was flat, carrying information. "The combination he prescribed triggers paradoxical vocal cord dysfunction in a statistically small but not negligible patient population with certain neurological markers. I apparently fall within that population. The episodes began 8 weeks after he started the protocol. He had the relevant literature available to him. He did not act on it." Madeleine listened. "I've terminated his contract. His medical license referral is with the Collège des Médecins as of this morning." Theo paused. "You knew this on Wednesday evening?" "I suspected it," she said. "I couldn't confirm without the prescribing records. How did you know to suspect it?" She told him about her father. She told him about the 30 months of watching René Ouellette lose precision in his hands, and the 2 years of fighting for treatment access, and 2 laryngospasm episodes that had happened in their apartment, and the 6 hours she had spent after the first one reading every pharmacological paper she could find on upper airway complications. Besoussant 4. She understood what was happening, she told him calmly, because she had long since used up the version of the story that made her cry. Theo listened in the same way he appeared to do most things, without any visible performance of listening, just the attentive stillness of someone actually doing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I made a promise in that dining room," he said. "You did. I was dying when I made it. My counsel has some views on the enforceability, I know." He nodded once, as though something had been confirmed. "I'm not going to hide behind that," he said. He turned briefly toward Patricia. She opened the folder on the desk. $1 million, Theo said. "Paid in full today by wire transfer. No NDA, no conditions." He glanced at the folder. "There is, in addition, a separate item." He looked back at Madeleine. "The private treatment program you need for your father. Ottawa Neurology Institute's experimental protocol. I've already spoken with the clinical director. They'll take him as a private patient, Full program, 4 cycles, beginning as soon as he can travel. Madeleine did not allow herself to move for a moment. She was very careful about this, because she had been disappointed a sufficient number of times to understand that the moment before certainty was the most dangerous one. "That's approximately $200,000, she said. "I'm aware of what it is." "Why?" she asked, not with suspicion. Genuinely. Theo looked out at the city for a moment. When he looked back, he had the expression of someone deciding how honest to be and then deciding to simply be honest. "Because you didn't just use a technique," he said. "You walked into a room where everyone outranked you, including the man whose job was literally to keep me alive, and you were the only person who understood what was actually happening, and then you were fired for it." He paused. "I've been in rooms like that from the other side. I know what it costs." He held out his hand. She shook it. The press conference happened the following week, and it was not the kind that Theo Arsenault's communications team had originally designed. There were no scripted lines about allergic reactions or isolated incidents. Theo stood at the podium in the same suit he'd worn to the dinner, or one identical to it, and he spoke for 11 minutes without notes, which was not something he typically did. He told them about the 2 years of episodes, about Dr. Fleury's prescription protocol and the pharmacological review that had confirmed the interaction, about filing the complaint with the medical, then licensing body, about the fact that the person who had identified the problem and physically intervened was a food service worker who had been fired for doing so, and about how he had subsequently confirmed that she had been right about every single thing, including the injection he had ordered Fleury not to give, eventually when it was nearly too late. He named her. The Arsenault capital stock price recovered by end-of-day Thursday and exceeded its previous high by the following. Monday, Callum Dench's office called on Tuesday morning. The merger closed 6 weeks later. Madeleine did not return to Chateau Bernard. She had thought briefly and with some complex emotion about whether she would want to. About Bertrand Foy's inspection lineups, the 2 a.m. bus, the sorted envelopes. She thought about the night she had first seen the red notation in the client file and stood at the terminal for 3 extra seconds, understanding exactly what she was reading. She returned instead to the pharmacology program at UDM, reinstated after a conversation between the Graduate Studies Office and Theo Arsenault's foundation that Madeleine had specifically requested she not be present for, on the grounds that she preferred to complete her degree on terms that were entirely hers. The department agreed. The fellowship she had been offered before she deferred was no longer available, having been awarded to someone else in the intervening time, but a different one was identified, and it suited her better anyway. René Ouellet began his first treatment cycle in Ottawa in early March. The improvement in the second week was not dramatic, which the clinical team had prepared them for, but by the third it was visible in his hands, small things first. The tremor reduced by a fraction when he held a glass. He was able to button his shirt the morning of day 19 without stopping twice. He held his hands up and looked at them, the way a carpenter looks at tools he is relearning to trust. "You did this," he said to Madeleine. She shook her head. "I read the chapter," she said. He laughed, which was a sound she had been collecting carefully for 3 years, storing each instance against the possibility of future shortage. Outside the clinic window, Ottawa was considering becoming spring, not committing to it yet, just indicating that the option existed. Madeleine stood at the window, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her father's laughter behind her, and the city's cautious, incremental light coming in from the west, and she thought about the 3 seconds of silence in a walnut-paneled room, the counting she had learned to do, the point at which pressure becomes rescue. She had always known what she was capable of. She had simply been waiting for a room that required it.